Very few meteorological phenomena inspire as much awe as that of a tornado. Stronger tornadoes, in fact, attain an awe-inspiring intensity of wind with speeds that actually exceed 200 miles an hour and in very extreme cases might actually approach 300 miles per hour. So what actually is a tornado? Well, as we can see by this image, a tornado actually represents a violently rotating column of air that extends between the ground and the above cloud. So let's consider another reason to study tornadoes, aside from the awe that it inspires within us. First, let's consider the top 10 disasters in terms of economic damages. This represents the National Climatic Data Center billion-dollar weather disasters. And it's very interesting to note that if we look at the top 10 weather disasters, we really do not find tornadoes on this list. In fact, what we find, is Hurricane Katrina, 2005. The damages associated with Katrina estimated to be upwards of $149 billion, an extraordinary amount of money. Other disasters include other hurricanes, along with droughts and floods. And if we look at the very bottom here, very bottom, in one of the most intense tornadic disasters in memory, back in 2011, the amount of economic damage was on the order of $10 billion. So those numbers actually pale in comparison with some of the other major weather disasters. But what is interesting about the tornadoes is the fact that despite the fact that the economic damages are relatively small compared with other phenomenon, we see the numbers here of deaths happen to be rather large. So the important aspect here is that tornadoes, even though they account for a relatively small amount of economic damage, in fact account for a substantial amount of fatalities as compared with other phenomenon. So for example, if we compare the tornadic outbreaks that we see here with others, those numbers are quite comparable to what we see for hurricanes, floods, heat waves, cold waves, rip currents, and high wind events. So tornadoes themselves really do represent an important component of loss of life compared with other disasters. The primary reason that tornadoes account for a significant amount of deaths as compared with other disasters include two elements. First of all, primarily warning time. Warning times for tornadoes tend to be very, very small as opposed to, for example, a hurricane. Hurricanes themselves, one can actually get warnings of as much as several days in advance. Whereas with a tornado, the warning times can be only a matter of minutes. And in fact, a good warning time, a very favorable amount of warning time, is about 10 to 20 minutes. So that's a very, very small time scale as compared with other warning times for other phenomena. The other aspect, of course, with respect to tornadic outbreaks, is the catastrophic nature of the damages. And this is only one example of what can happen in the vicinity of a tornado. Another interesting aspect here is the fatalities. We mentioned that tornado fatalities themselves are actually rather substantial. But if we actually look at the variability of deaths from year to year over the last several decades, we see that overall, the trend, if there is a trend here, is that the number of people actually killed yearly by tornadoes appears to be ever so slightly decreasing. Now, clearly, in terms of looking at a picture like this, here's an outlier back in 2011, a very serious year for tornado deaths. But in general, the number of people that are actually killed has gone down over the years. If we look at the number of fatalities as they're decreasing, even though this is happening, the interesting thing is that the number of reported tornadoes has actually gone up over the years. Now that's somewhat in contrast to what we're looking at in this picture, because looking here, we see that the annual count of tornadic activity that is represented by a threshold of the enhanced Fujita scale of 1 or greater appears not to have changed over the years. So actually the number of tornadoes being reported over the years is related to the fact that most of the increase is due to weak tornadoes, that of so-called EF0 and EF1s. The larger tornadoes, the most intense tornadoes, appear to be not changing over the period of years. So this is an annual count, in fact, of rather strong to more violent tornadoes between 1954 and 2012, the Fujita scale 3 and above. And we actually see if there's any trend here at all, it's quite likely that it's downward or perhaps staying the same. So an important aspect of this statistic is the fact that in earlier years, back in the 50s and 60s, when we did not have necessarily the technology or the encroachment of populations into previously agricultural areas, those tornadoes that are actually violent or intense would still have been reported just as much back in the 50s and the 60s as we have currently. It's in fact the weaker tornadoes that in the earlier days probably had not been reported that are being reported right now. So in summary, the number of tornado deaths appears to be decreasing over the years, and the actual counts of tornadoes that we see has not really changed much over the previous several decades.